In December of 1958, Frank Farana Jr. was born in San Jose, California. His father left the family when Frank was 3 years old, so he was raised by his single mother and his mom's parents. But soon after that, when he was 6, his mother also abandoned him.
Ooh.
So he moved in with his grandparents. Apparently, she just couldn't handle being a parent, so she called her parents to come pick him up. But she couldn't wait until they got there, so she left him sitting on the front porch, locked the door, and went off with some random guy. And he said that he has never really gotten over that feeling of abandonment.
Whoa, weird.
It's weird how actions can have an impact on your kids. While living with his grandparents, he relocated several times. His grandfather was a mechanic, and they never really had a lot of money, but they tried hard to be good parents. It was in Idaho that he first started getting into a little bit of trouble. He broke into his neighbors' homes, he shoplifted, and he was expelled from school for selling drugs. His grandparents sent him to live with his mother, who at this point was in Seattle.
That's an interesting move.
Yeah, I guess she had figured some things out, was getting her life back on track. I don't know. But when he was in Seattle living with his mother, he stole a guitar, sold that guitar, and used the money to buy a bass that he started learning how to play.
I feel like we could have cut out the middleman there.
Talking about his early life years later, he said, quote, "I had a bad upbringing, and I'm dealing with that every day. I spent more money on therapy than most rock stars spent on cars," end quote. He said that since he never really had a strong father figure, he looked up to rock stars like Keith Richards and just started to copy their style and interests. Then he heard about the LA punk scene and the partying that they were doing and felt like he was missing out. So at the age of 17, he moved to Los Angeles to audition for different bands. He also started going by the name Nicky Six. While trying to make it, he worked some menial jobs like selling vacuums over the phone and working at a liquor store. He answered an ad in a magazine for a band named Sister that was looking for a bassist. He got the job, recorded a couple of demos with them, and was then fired. He then joined the glam rock band called London and recorded a bit with them, but it didn't last long and he left the band soon after starting it. That band, though it didn't achieve any of its own success, actually had several prominent members. They had Nicky, who went on to be in Mötley Crüe. They had a member of the band Wasp, which was a pretty big glam metal band, and a member of Guns N' Roses in the band. Then in 1981, when Nicky was 22 years old, he met at a Denny's to talk to a drummer from a band called Sweet 19.
That is where all of the good business dinners happen.
Especially in LA. Nicky saw Sweet 19 play live and loved the drummer's style, so he and Tommy Lee met to talk about starting their own band. Thomas Lee Bass, or Bass, but probably Bass, was born in 1962 in Athens, Greece. His dad was a sergeant in the army, and his mother was a contestant in the 1957 Miss Greece beauty pageant. When he was about 2 years old, they moved back to the United States and settled in California. He got his first pair of drumsticks when he was 4 years old and his first drum set as a teenager. His first main drum influence was Peter Criss from the band Kiss. Tommy knew he wanted to be a musician, so he dropped out of high school and started playing in the LA club scenes, where he was known as T-Bone, because he was 6'3" and very skinny. I couldn't really find much information about Sweet 19. I know that Tommy joined them when he was only 17, and like a lot of these club bands in the same scene, members would come and go and join other bands, some of which got mildly popular and most didn't. A guitarist for Sweet 19 ended up being in the band Quiet Riot, who helped explode metal in the US, but somehow Tommy got involved with this band and Nicky saw one of their shows. By the time Nicky was looking to start his own band, Sweet 19 was kind of like dead, and Tommy Lee was all ears for a new opportunity. Apparently, Nicky wanted to start a theatrical metal band that borrowed from the occult themes of his first band, Sister. So the two started to look for more members for the band. Originally, they worked with Greg Leon on vocals, who was also a member of Sweet 19, but they rehearsed quite a bit with him, and Greg decided that it really wasn't a great fit for him, and he left the band. So the duo of Nicky and Tommy needed a singer and some other guitarists. That's when they saw an advertisement in a magazine called The Recycler that said, quote, "Loud, rude, and aggressive guitar player available," end quote.
A person knows how to market themselves.
Right. They knew what they were looking for. A guy named Bob Deal had placed the ad. So they responded to the ad, and Bob Deal, who is better known as Mick Mars, auditioned and joined the band.
Mick Mars is better than Bob Deal.
Bob Deal?
Yeah.
Okay. Bob Deal was born in Indiana in 1951. His family moved around a lot when he was younger, trying to find better job prospects. In Indiana, he saw a country act play at a fair, and that's when he decided that music was what he wanted to do with his life. He later said that he was only 3 years old when that happened, but he still knew,
I don't know that I believe that.
Yeah.
I don't remember being 5 years old.
He said, quote, "I saw this country musician play at the fair. His name was Skeeter Bond, and he had on this orange outfit with sequins all over it.
That would catch my attention as a 3-year-old. We're back on track.
And he wore this large Stetson hat, and he played guitar and sang. I said, that's what I'm doing with my life."
Hat and all. Sequins and all.
Yep, he was known for his orange outfits with sequins. Before he was 9 years old, his family moved to California. That was the move that stuck and shaped Bob's life. Orange County had a thriving music scene that Bob wasted no time jumping into. He quickly dropped out of school to focus on music. Like they all did, he joined a few different, mostly blues rock bands, and they were all unsuccessful. Bob just kind of struggled around in the local music scene for basically a decade before he decided to reinvent himself. He changed his name to Mick Mars and dyed his hair jet black. In April of 1980, he put that ad in the Recycler magazine, which eventually led to the band that changed the rest of his life. He was also a decade older than the other members of the band and way more seasoned in the local scene. So they had all the musicians they needed. Now they needed a singer. Tommy Lee had an old friend from high school named Vince Neil, who was a singer. The two had played together in a few garage bands as they were coming up, and then Mick saw him perform with a band called Rock Candy in Hollywood.
Rock Candy is a good name.
So Mick suggested that the band ask Vince Neil to join. At first, Vince declined the offer. After all, he was already in a band that was playing somewhat high-profile shows. Why risk that to join an upstart band? But then members of Rock Candy all started to pursue other projects, and Vince Neil got a little bit anxious about his position in that band. So he eventually took them up on their offer, and just like that, the band had a singer. Vince Neil was born in Hollywood in 1961. His family moved around a bit in Southern California before finally settling in Compton. I don't know if you know much about Compton, but it's not necessarily the most family-friendly place.
I know that you can come straight out of it.
Vince once had his face slashed by a gang member, so he had to become streetwise to survive. But he was also dyslexic, so he struggled in school and was eventually expelled. Before he got expelled, he was really into sports and surfing, even making the school's surfing team. He started singing and playing with garage bands around the age of 14 or 15, and he always knew that music was his first love. He joined Rock Candy when he was just 17 years old and joined Mötley Crüe when he was 18. Vince also had a son with his girlfriend when he was 16 or 17. I can't really find that much information about that relationship or that son, despite the fact that he became a somewhat successful rock musician in his own right, but I guess it's none of my business, so I guess it's probably fine that I can't find information about him. Pretty soon after joining Mötley Crüe, Vince married a girl named Beth Lynn. In his autobiography, Vince calls her a rich girl from San Diego.
That is the type of girl you want to marry.
Right. He also says they met through Nikki Sixx and that she was a groupie, but was also, quote, super hot. They got together because Nikki Sixx wanted to have a threesome with Beth and Vince. But then Nikki passed out. So Vince and Beth just kind of went ahead without him. And then from that night on, they were dating. When they met, Vince was in a serious relationship and was about to get married, but he ended it for Beth. A running theme is that they're not that nice to women. So just hold off on your praise for any of these guys. Vince says that he can't remember why they got married. They were doing a lot of drugs at the time, but he thinks he cheated on her and getting married was his way of apologizing.
Nice.
As you might guess, with that rock-solid foundation, the marriage didn't work, and they divorced a few years later.
I was giving a month, so...
Yeah, I mean, they made it a little bit. Vince officially joined on April 1st, 1981, and they played their first show on April 24th. There's a common legend that Nikki says is true, that first show ended in a fist fight. He said, quote, "The very first show, Vince and I ended up in the crowd in a fist fight. That kind of set a precedent for who we are and what we do."
Fighting each other?
I don't think so. I think fighting the crowd. But at this time, they still didn't have a name. Nikki was thinking of calling them Christmas. But then Mick remembered when someone called one of his old bands a motley-looking crew. He liked the phrase and wrote it down to use at some point in the future. So they kind of messed up the spelling a bit and settled on Mötley Crüe as their name. Things moved pretty quickly after that. They were playing a lot of shows in the Hollywood club scene and getting pretty popular in that local area. They landed a manager who set up a record label for them to basically self-produce their first album. They released a single called Stick to Your Guns before releasing their debut album in November of 1981. That debut album, that was self-produced, ended up selling 20,000 copies. Their manager used the group's massive success in Hollywood to start negotiating some record deals for the group. They eventually signed with Elektra Records in early 1982, less than a year after forming, and Elektra reproduced and re-released that debut album. We can't really have a Mötley Crüe episode without talking about some of their shenanigans, so I figured I'd just give you brief headline-type stories of the early time of their band. So this was when they were all living in a crappy apartment on the Sunset Strip, an apartment infested with roaches that they'd burn with a lighter and hairspray.
We've all been there.
Because they couldn't afford the bug poison. They also didn't buy toilet paper to save money, so they'd use socks and magazine pages when they needed to. They once poured gas on a tree in their courtyard and set it on fire, just for fun. Tommy Lee slept with a studio engineer to get the band some free time in the studio.
Yeah.
Which is how they ended up recording their first singles. Vince Neil once bought cocaine from a drag queen, which turned out to be baby powder. So he got into a massive bar fight with the drag queen/dealer. Nicky once got super fed up with a punk rock poser hanging around their apartment that he nailed the guy's earlobe to the coffee table. They once peed inside a cop car after the cop was giving them a hard time at a bar.
That just sounds like a bad idea.
Yeah. So all of that was the early days. Mötley Crüe was about to make it big and take these antics to a whole different level. Elektra sent them on their first tour, which was a tour of Canada in 1982. And they immediately started to get into more shenanigans. They were arrested at customs for wearing their spiked stage wardrobes through security, which were considered dangerous weapons. Well, also, at that same airport, Vince had a small carry-on that was filled with porn. So that was confiscated and destroyed.
That seems unfair.
But,
I'm going to call the airport out on that one.
Well, both of those events were staged PR stunts. There was also a bomb threat at their show in Edmonton, which also ended up being a stage stunt by their PR guy.
So that's bad.
Yeah.
That one is really bad.
Yeah.
I don't like.
Then Tommy Lee threw a TV set through their upper story hotel room's window, which resulted in them being banned from that city for life. The tour ended early in financial disaster, but these highly publicized incidents set the stage of what the band was going to be like. Later that year, they fired their manager and replaced him with the manager for Bon Jovi and Kiss. So someone who had a little bit of experience in this whole scene. In 1983, they started working on a new album. The title track. In 1983, they started out on what would be the biggest tour so far for them, opening for Kiss. The two bands were on opposite ends of the spectrum. With their one album slowly gaining a little bit of traction, Mötley Crüe were on the rise. Meanwhile, Kiss were declining rapidly. They thought that the Crüe could help them sell tickets on the West Coast. Nicky explained that the band's mindset going into the tour, quote, "We just wanted to get in the ring with anybody. The ring was getting on that stage, playing in front of anybody's crowd. We didn't care whose it was because we believed in ourselves and we were in that place. We were in that positive place. Everything we were doing was working internally," end quote. They only ended up playing a handful of shows with Kiss. Apparently they were so unruly that Gene Simmons fired them. Meanwhile, the band started to become successful in the mainstream. Already, they were known as hardcore partiers and a bit infamous. Also through MTV and playing a few bigger festivals, they got their name out there. Everything changed with their second album, which was called Shout at the Devil, and it was released in September of 1983.
That is a better title.
Okay.
I shout at the devil.
All right. Probably not in the same way. This album broke them fully into the mainstream, eventually going 4 times platinum. Of course, it invoked a lot of controversy because it looked like Satanism. During the recording of this album, Nicky Sixx got super drunk, stumbled naked into his friend's Porsche, sped away from watching fans, and promptly crashed into a pole, which hurt his shoulder pretty bad, and he was prescribed Percocet. But that Percocet subscription ended up leading him into a crippling heroin addiction that cost him, he said, roughly $3,500 per day at its peak.
Oh, whoa.
So that album got the attention of Ozzy Osbourne, who invited them on tour to support it. During that tour, Ozzy dared Nikki Sixx to pee on the floor and lick it up. So Nikki peed on the floor, but Ozzy ended up drinking it. Ozzy says he has no memory of this happening, but the band swears it happened. They said that they were a young band and Ozzy took them under his wing. Nikki said, quote, "We thought we could compete with that, but you can't with Ozzy. He won." End quote. During this tour, the band seriously considered firing Mick and replacing him with a more technical guitarist. But when they asked for advice from a more technical guitarist that they actually wanted to hire, he said, quote, "Don't fix what isn't broken." In 1984, after that album and tour, Vince Neil drove drunk and ended up in a terrible crash that killed the drummer for the band Hanoi Rocks. Vince ended up spending 18 days in jail. That, paired with Nicky's rapidly increasing heroin addiction and their reputation for nonstop partying, really made people think that they were a dangerous band. In 1985, they released their third album that ushered in a glam metal phase in their style. It was commercially successful, reaching number 6 in the chart, but critics largely didn't love it. Nikki Sixx was the primary songwriter, and he was heavily addicted to heroin during this. He even wrote one song, Dancing on Glass, about the time he OD'd on heroin at his dealer's house. His dealer thought it was too risky to take him to the hospital, so he dumped Nikki in a dumpster. The next morning, Nikki woke up very confused.
I'm glad he woke up.
This album also featured a successful ballad that kind of paved the way for the power ballad being a massive thing in this genre. In 1986, Tommy Lee saw Heather Locklear, who was an actress, backstage at a concert and asked someone to introduce them because he was too nervous to talk to her. They then had a whirlwind relationship that ended up with them getting married when Tommy was 23.
Wow. That's, like, it's just weird to think about how young everyone still is.
Right. The relationship was pretty rocky, and Tommy admitted to cheating on her multiple times with adult film stars. They ended up divorcing in 1993. Meanwhile, Vince Neil also got married again in 1987 to a model and mud wrestler. They had one daughter and divorced in 1993.
The year of divorces.
Right. Nikki got engaged to a model and singer who had sung with Prince and supposedly been Prince's lover for a while. Her name was Vanity. Nikki said, quote, "At the time, I thought of Vanity as a disposable human being.
Oh.
Like a used needle.
What?
Once its purpose was fulfilled, it was ready for the trash, only to be dug up if you were really desperate. We became drug buddies. Sometimes you could even just about call us boyfriend and girlfriend." End quote. But it wasn't a good relationship, and when they broke up, Nikki married a Playboy playmate.
They really love marriage.
Yeah. One of Vanity's movie co-stars invited her to read the Bible. She found Jesus, renounced her life as Vanity, and became a full-time Christian evangelist.
Stop it.
Until she passed away from kidney failure in 2016.
Stop. What?
Yeah. In 1987, their fourth album debuted at number 2. Nikki believes the album would have debuted at number 1 if it wasn't for the behind-the-scenes negotiations that Whitney Houston's label did to get her album number 1. They again changed their image from the glam rock style to a more biker aesthetic, and again, Nikki wrote a song inspired by a heroin overdose. This time, a paramedic who was a fan of the band revived him with 2 shots of adrenaline in an ambulance, which inspired the song called Kickstart My Heart. Things were starting to come to a head with their party lifestyle. Nikki Sixx, who had kept a diary every day during his heroin addiction, entered rehab. The band's managers refused to let them tour Europe, thinking that at least a couple of them would come back in body bags. The last time they toured Europe, Tommy Lee and Nikki Sixx would break bottles over each other's heads and swallow light bulbs just because they were bored. Shortly after that, they all entered rehab together in an effort to move the band forward. In the fall of 1989, they released Dr. Feelgood, which is widely considered their best album. For the first time, the members of the band recorded their parts separately to cut back on infighting and focus on the playing. It hit number 1 and stayed in the charts for 114 weeks. They spent most of the next couple of years on a massive tour that left them feeling pretty burnt out. This was also around the time that their genre of music was on the downward spiral. They released a compilation album in 1991, and after that, Vince Neil left the band.
Compilation albums. Not a good sign.
No. It's not really known if Vince quit or if he was kicked out. Vince says he was kicked out. Nikki says he quit. Vince later said that it was a rehearsal spat that got him out of control and the management just kind of let them break up. Their next album, without Vince, did not do that well. Fans hated the band without Vince, and the album just didn't sell. Things weren't looking good. Meanwhile, Vince released a somewhat successful solo album. Towards the end of 1996, Rolling Stone broke the news that the band would be reuniting with Vince Neil. They released a new album that debuted at number 4, but was a commercial failure, largely because their label just didn't support it. In 1999, during a bit of a hiatus, Tommy Lee announced that he was leaving the band. He didn't get along with Vince, and he didn't enjoy playing that type of music anymore. Right before leaving the band, Tommy Lee married model and actress Pamela Anderson. They filmed a sex tape on a boat that was stolen and illegally released online. It became probably the first major celebrity sex tape scandal.
Major bummer.
There's now a Hulu series about that whole situation. Starring Nick Offerman, I think.
What?
I think he's one of the guys who, stole it and distributed it.
Shame on you, Nick.
Just to be clear, he played a guy.
Shame on you, Nick Offerman.
For clear, he was not involved. I trusted you. The actual actor was not involved in this situation. The band released a new album in 2000, and after that album, they went into hiatus. Nicky worked with other bands, Vince appeared in a few VH1 shows, like The Surreal Life, and Mick stepped away to focus on his health. In 2005, they reunited for another tour. They released a book authored by all 4 of them called Dirt, and Nicky released his diaries as a book. Since then, they've done several retirements and reunions, even doing a cruise at one point. But anyway, they're mostly just kind of living the life of famous rock stars. Mick Mars has suffered from a form of chronic arthritis that left him in a ton of pain. It causes his lower spine to freeze up, leading to scoliosis.
That's rough.
He said in 2013 that his neck was so stiff that he couldn't even drive a car. So, in 2022, he announced that he would be retiring from touring with the band to focus on his health. And that's just kind of all the updates. They're still just out there, just living that life of once famous rock stars.